Algebra. So this is going to be a recap of your box and whiskers, and your assignment today is actually going to be focused on just reading them. Most times when you take an algebra regents, the box and whisker questions aren't necessarily creating them, but reading them. And the big thing to realize is that these box and whiskers contain the same 5 pieces of data every single time. There's always a minimum, that's meaning the smallest value, a Q1, also called first quartile or lower quartile, and that represents the middle of the smaller half of the data set. We have our median, which is also sometimes called the second quartile because it's the second line in the box, and that means the middle value that is in your data. We have our third quartile, Q3, also called upper quartile, and that represents the middle of the larger side of our data. And then last but not least, we have our maximum, which is your largest value that you have. Whenever I'm looking at a box and whisker, those 5 pieces of information are always in the same order, and they are always the same 5 pieces that we will need in order for us to be able to create a box and whisker. Now, when I'm looking at my information, the very first thing it wants to know was what is the high score that was on this test. And when I'm referring to a high score, I'm referring to its maximum. So we would go into our picture and we would look at the higher end, almost like it's a number line, and the value that we see that is being used is 102. And if I look back at my title, test scores as a percent for 6th period, that tells us that this 102 represents 102% from a test. So we can say that the maximum, remember that means largest or biggest, is 102%. Moving on down to question number 2. What percent of the class scored above a 72? Now, this word right here, percent, is actually quite important to us, because if I look at the box and whisker right now, you're going to notice there are no percents. And you're going to think, well, how am I supposed to answer this question? So think of it in the sense of this entire picture represents 100% of my data. If I look, there are 4 sections that are created when I draw the box and whisker. The first section falls between the minimum and our Q1. Our second is between Q1 and our median. Our third is between the median and Q3. And then our fourth is between Q3 and our maximum. And if I think about it in the sense of taking $1 and breaking it up into 4 quarters, that means that each one of these is representing 25% of the data. So we will figure out how to find the percent by figuring out what the question wants us to focus in on. So question number 2 said above a 72. So if here's 72 and I want to be above it, we need to look at the values that are larger. And so if I look at my tracing, I have touched 1, 2, 3 different quarters. If I ask myself, how many is that? That's me 25 plus another 25 plus another 25. And we can say that 75% of the data is from 72 and above. And I'm going to remove some of my marks here, just that way we can continue marking it up later. But I am going to keep the sections 1, 2, 3, and 4 up there to remind ourselves where all of our pieces are that represent 25% of the data. So moving on to question number 3, they want us to figure out what is the median. And the median represents the middle. And I do want to bring this up in the sense of I'm not talking about middle of the graph. Like if I was to cut this line down the center, where would that number be? No. The middle is always going to represent the line that's inside of our box. And in this case, it's going to represent 88. So we can say that the median score is 88. And again, our title says that these numbers are percent, so I'm going to put that in my sentence. So the median, or the middle number of our test scores from 6th period is 88%. Number 4 wants us to look at the percent for the class that scored between 88 and 96. So again, percent means I'm trying to figure out how many sections, 1, 2, 3, or 4, are used based off of the question I'm using or trying to answer. So it's telling me between 88 and 96. So if I'm 88, 96, if I'm between there, I'm only touching or in section 3. That tells me that we are 25%. Okay. So if we move on down, it wants us to answer the next question. Number 5. Do you think this test was too hard for the students, and explain? There are 2 parts to this question. The very first part wants us to be able to answer, do we think that this test is hard? Is it too hard for the kids? So we can either say, yes, it is too hard, or no, it was not too hard. But that's not the only thing I'm looking for. I also ask you to explain. So because I'm asking you to explain, I need to have a because statement and a reasoning behind it. So let's take a look at my actual data. And if I'm thinking about the idea of kind of like this percent, 75%, 3/4 of the crew, most of them, scored 72 or higher. If I was to think about what it means to be a hard test, you ask yourself, would that mean me passing or failing that test? Well, if it's hard, I probably fail it. If it's not hard, I'll probably pass it. So if we can see that a majority of our data, the majority of our students are right here, and we only have the minimum at this low point, then that tells me this test wasn't hard. It was hard for this one person, but most of my class, my kids in 6th period, seem to have done quite well. So in this case, we can say, in a response to question number 5, no, the test was not hard. That gives me only 1 point because I answered the one question. I did not explain my reasoning. So we're going to say because most data was actually, let's change that up. Because most students received a 72 on their quiz, their test, or higher. And that's above passing. Question number 6. Would you expect the mean to be above or below the median? And for those of you that may have forgotten, the mean is if I was to take every single data point and add them together and then divide by how many pieces of data there were, that would represent the average or the mean, which is another way of being able to, especially for teachers, figure out where you guys are in terms of your work. Now, in this case, your median, let's remind ourselves, according to our answer for number 3, was actually this right here. So if our median, which means taking every single student, putting their scores in order and finding the center, their median was 88. If I wanted to calculate the mean, we'd have to take every single digit, add them together, and divide by how many students took the test. This is a little bit different. Your mean is greatly affected by the actual fact that we have to do math with it. With the median, all I'm doing is putting numbers in order and finding the center. So if I tag on a very high grade or a very low grade, it doesn't matter. But in this story, we have someone who stands out in comparison to all of their other classmates. This person got a 38. So we know this test was super hard for them specifically. But the rest of the class did quite well. So because this person had a really low grade, it's going to affect our mean a lot because we have to count that person. They took a test. We need their grade. But because their grade was so bad, it's going to throw off where our mean is. Usually, if the data is pretty even and it follows the path, it will match up right where the median is. The mean and the median will be the same. So in this case, because I'm being dragged this way, that means my mean will also be dragged this way. So the question wanted to know if it would be lower or higher than our median. Because I have to follow where this very low grade was, we are going backwards. Our mean is being tugged backward. So we would actually say that our mean would be lower. Let me change that from that. Our mean would be below the median because our minimum of 38 is so low than the rest of the data. And I'm writing this quite large just to be able to have you be able to see it. So again, if you have a really high number, let's say this person racked out 150 on their quiz, that would make our mean have to go forward because it's going to follow that large number. In our example, we had a very low test grade, a 38. It pulled my mean backwards because of the fact that it had to count that 38, even though it was so far different than everything else in the data. So sometimes that happens. If you have to count a number that is way off in comparison to the rest of the data, it will sometimes, actually most of the times, affect your mean when you are doing your calculations. It won't match up to the median. So in that case, this is our example for number 1. Your independent practice is going to be with questions 7 through 11, and you are going to be using the box and whisker that says average minutes per night spent on homework. So it tells us to use the box and whisker graph below that shows how much time was spent per night on homework for sophomore class at a certain high school during September. So we are seeing that this student right here replied they spent no time on their homework. Not a good idea. While this person said that they spent 190 minutes on homework. Okay. Again, we have our Q1, which is our first quartile. That represents the middle of our lower half. We have our median, our middle value, 48. And we have Q3, that's the middle of the upper half, as 60. So you are going to be answering questions 7 through 11 based off of this picture, and we will be discussing this after you are finished. So number 7 wants to know what percent of sophomores spend more than 60 minutes on homework per night. And I'll get you started on this by reminding you that there are always 4 sections or pieces that your graph gets split into. It does not matter how big or changed in size they are. Okay? So this one is 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. So each individual spot is 25%. You are going to be reading to figure out where you're starting and where it wants you to end, and then count your sections to figure out the exact percentage of that piece. Question number 8. What is the range of times that the middle 50% of the sophomores spend on homework per night? This one I'm going to star because this is going to be a double whammy. You will have to think back to what it means to calculate the range. And if I'm saying middle 50%, I'll give you a little hint. That will be your box. And if you're thinking about it, remember 50% means I have to have 2 sections. And because I'm in the middle, I will be this box. So from here to here, I want to know what is the range. Number 9, how many sophomores do not do homework? 10. What percent of sophomores spend less than 20 minutes per night on homework? And question 11. Would you expect the mean number of minutes per night to be higher or lower than the median? Explain. You can look back at your previous examples to help you. Reach out if you need anything.